Hi, friends. Happy Thursday. Today in reading, we are going to reread the story Grace for President. After we read the story, you're going to work on your own routine writing prompt that talks about point of view. So, the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen so that way we can reread the story. All right. Grace for President. One Monday morning in September, Mrs. Barrington rolled out a big poster with all of the president's pictures on it. Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. Where are the girls? That's a very good question, said Mrs. Barrington. The truth is, our country has never had a woman president. No girl president? Ever? Grace asked. No, I'm afraid not, said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No girls? Who'd ever heard of such a crazy thing? Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Grace? I've been thinking it over, and I'd like to be president. Several students in the class laughed. Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace, said Mrs. Barrington. In fact, we can have our own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary. The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. Would anyone else like to run for president? Mrs. Barrington asked the class. Nobody raised their hand. Becoming president was going to be easy, Grace thought. The next day, Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. In the name of democracy, I have invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate. Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school spelling bee champion. His experiments always took a blue ribbon at the science fair, and he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president wasn't going to be so easy after all, Grace thought. The teachers put the names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia into a hat. Everyone except for Grace and Thomas got to choose a state. I'm Texas, said Anthony. I'm New Hampshire, said Rose. I'm Michigan, said Robbie. What does the number 17 mean? Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number is determined by how many people live in that state, said Mrs. Barrington. Each of you will put a representative of your for your state. Although our country has 538 electoral votes, Mr. Waller explained. On election day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. Why 270? Asked Rose. That's more than half of all electoral votes, Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be so easy, Grace thought. Grace came up with a campaign slogan, Make history, vote Grace Campbell for president. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan, Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job. Grace listened to what issues were important to students, and she made a list of promises. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons too. Each week, the teachers set aside time for the candidates to meet with their constituents. Polls were taken. Voters were making their choices. Grace continued to campaign. At recess, she gave speeches. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes. After school, she held rallies. Meanwhile, Thomas wasn't worried. He had cleverly calculated that the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. At recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on his latest science experiment, and after school, he played soccer. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad, she organized a school beautification committee, and she volunteered her time in the school cafeteria. In early November, Woodrow Wilson Elementary hosted a special Election Day assembly. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage as the school band began to play. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellowhammer State of Alabama cast its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb. Fletcher said, "The last frontier state of Alaska cast its 3 electoral votes for the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb." Hannah called out, "The Grand Canyon state of Arizona cast 10 electoral votes for Grace Campbell." And so it went. State after state after state cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of the totals. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. "The Badger State of Wisconsin cast its 10 votes for my best friend, Grace Campbell." Grace looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes. She had 267. There was only one state still unaccounted for, Wyoming. Thomas grinned. Grace felt sick. Sam walked up to the microphone. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Grace. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. Sam didn't say a word. "What are you waiting for?" Thomas whispered. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. "The equality state of Wyoming cast its 3 electoral votes for Grace Campbell." The gymnasium erupted in loud cheers and a few boos. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. "With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell." Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. "Because," he said, "I thought you were the best person for the job." The following week, the students in Mrs. Barrington's class were preparing for their career day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood at the front of the room and glanced at the poster still hanging on the wall. "My name is Grace Campbell, and when I grow up, I'm going to be President of the United States." And this time, everyone believed that she would. The end. So glad we were able to reread that story. Now we are ready to work on our routine writing prompt. So the first thing I want us to look at is how writers write. So when we're writing, we always want to make sure we write a topic sentence that tells the main idea. The next thing we want to remember is to write sentences that support that main idea. And then the last thing I want you to remember is to include a closing sentence. That's the structure and the order of your routine writing prompts. So now let's go into our routine writing prompt. All right, our routine writing question says, "How are Grace and Thomas's point of view the same or different in the story?" So we know since they're asking questions about the story, we always have to go back to the story. So you are more than welcome to rewind this video to go back and listen and reread again to Miss Henderson's story that she just read to you. So the 3 things I want you to remember and keep in mind, and the helpful tips to help you do your best on your routine writing, is the first thing, do you think their point of view was the same or different? So think to yourself and think back to the story. Did you think that Grace's and Thomas's point of view were the same or different? And if you agree with that statement, if you think their point of view was the same at one point and their point of view was different, you can say your topic sentence can be a main idea that says Grace's and Thomas's point of view was the same and different throughout this story or throughout the entire story, Grace for President. And that's your topic sentence. It tells the main idea. We know that we're going to be talking about point of view, and we know point of view is something that we're either thinking or something that the character is feeling. So how do you think Grace and Thomas was thinking the same or thinking differently? What were they doing the same? What were they doing that was differently? That's for your topic sentence. The next thing I want you to remember is when you're going to do your 3 supporting details. Go back to the text, and it says to use page 396 to 397 and use page 398 to 399 for your supporting details. You can go back to the video. You can see the page numbers at the bottom of the screen. You can either listen closely, look at the pictures, or you can reread it yourself to help find your supporting ideas. Remember, you need 3 supporting ideas to tell me to support your topic sentence. So you're finding 3 details that support whether Grace and Thomas's point of view was the same or whether it was different. The next thing I want you to remember is to always go back when you're doing your closing sentence. Go back to the topic sentence to write your closing sentence. The idea or the hint that Ms. Henderson always gives you is the closing sentence is very similar to the topic sentence. You're rewriting it, but you're just using different words to close out your entire paragraph. I hope this was super helpful for you guys. Remember, you can use the resources that Ms. Henderson gave you. Go back, utilize this video, and go back throughout the video to reread the story to find your amazing points. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and I would love to help you. Have a happy Thursday.